Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to The Missing Dots, a space where difficult questions are not feared and honest conversations are not avoided. Here, we explore the journey between belief and doubt, certainty and confusion, truth and interpretation. Every episode opens a new door, challenges a familiar idea, and invites you to think deeper than ever before. This is not about proving anyone wrong. It's about understanding the human search for meaning. If you're ready to question, reflect, and connect to the missing dots, you're in the right place.
It's just really peaceful out here today in the courtyard.
Yeah, it really is. You can sort of hear the street noise just a little bit, but inside these walls, it's totally still.
Right, which is, I think, the perfect setting for what we're talking about today. Because, well, when someone goes through a real crisis of faith, the internal noise, the anxiety in their own head is just deafening.
Oh, absolutely. It's completely overwhelming.
Yeah, so having a quiet space to just sit and talk through it is really necessary. We're looking at this research paper today, and it's analyzing a very public, very raw conversation.
Right, the YouTube discussion between Sahil and Dr. Faraz Siddiqui.
Exactly. Dr. Siddiqui is a physician, and he's a former devout Muslim who ended up leaving the faith and becoming an atheist.
Yeah.
And the video they recorded was literally titled, "Why is Islam Abandoned?"
And it got a massive reaction, right? Like you look at the views and the comments, and it clearly struck a nerve with people.
It really did.
Yeah.
Because people are having these exact same arguments in their own lives, at the dinner table and WhatsApp groups or just lying awake at night.
Yeah, it's very real for a lot of people. And what I found so interesting about this paper is that it doesn't just critique the video.
Right.
It uses that specific conversation as a mirror for the whole modern crisis of faith.
Right. They actually broke the dialogue down into exactly 100 questions.
Wow, 100. That's a lot.
Yeah, it is. They mapped out all the most common, the most painful objections people have today. History, philosophy, theology, all of it.
And the goal here, just so we're clear, isn't to attack either of those guys, right?
No, not at all. The paper is totally impartial in that sense. It's really just bringing in classical Islamic scholarship and some modern academic studies to see how this ancient intellectual tradition responds to these modern moments of collapse.
Okay, so where does it start? Because when someone tells you they're losing their faith, it usually just sounds like this giant tangled knot of problems.
That's a great way to put it. A tangled knot. And the paper actually starts by untangling it. Before they even touch the history or the texts, they draw this really hard line between two different types of doubt.
Okay, what are they?
They call one experiential or emotional doubt, and the other is intellectual doubt.
Experiential doubt. So meaning like something they went through personally.
Exactly. It's driven by lived experience. So maybe they suffered some kind of severe moral trauma or, religious abuse.
Right.
Or maybe they just looked at people who claimed to represent the religion and saw them acting with incredible cruelty, and they felt totally pushed out of their own community.
So the doubt starts in the heart, like in the gut. The world just feels wrong to them and the community feels toxic.
Yes, the belief shatters because the people holding the belief failed them, or because the pain they see in the world is just too heavy to reconcile with a loving God.
That makes total sense, and that's very different from the second type.
Very different, because intellectual doubt is what philosophers call an epistemic crisis, a crisis of knowledge.
Right, so that's more about the mind.
Yeah. This happens when someone is, say, reading a historical text, or they stumble across what looks like a contradiction in an ancient manuscript, or they read a philosopher who just pokes a massive hole in the concept of divine justice.
So the pain there is realizing that something you thought was a solid historical fact might not be.
Exactly. But here's the thing. When you listen to that conversation between Sahil and Dr. Siddiqui, it's not strictly one or the other. It's a hybrid.
Right, because he starts with his personal story, but then he brings up all these very specific historical and textual arguments.
Yeah, and this is where the paper gives a massive warning to anyone having these conversations. It warns against making what they call a category error.
Category error, meaning mixing the two up.
Yes. If you mix up the emotional with the intellectual, you end up doing incredible damage to the person you're talking to.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. I was thinking about this earlier. It's like, imagine I'm sitting with a friend who's just crying because they lost their job, they can't pay rent, their livelihood is gone.
Right, a terrible situation.
And instead of comforting them, I pull out a whiteboard and start explaining the macroeconomic principles of inflation and corporate downsizing.
That is exactly it. It's tone deaf. The paper actually talks about this in the context of the Islamic etiquette of debate. If someone comes to you in deep existential pain, maybe they just witnessed a war or they've been abused, their objection is an emotional cry.
Right, they're bleeding.
They are. And if you respond to that pain by handing them detached, dry analysis of 7th century manuscript transmission,
Yeah.
you have completely failed them as a human being.
You know, it's like being in a hospital. Let's say a patient is brought into the ER and they're screaming in agony with a broken leg.
Right.
If the doctor just stands there and reads them the biochemical formula of the pain medication, I mean, the doctor isn't technically wrong about the chemistry, right?
No, the chemistry is real.
But reading a formula to a screaming patient is a complete failure of care in that moment. They need empathy first. The structural cure comes next.
That's a perfect analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And the paper argues the reverse is also a massive failure.
How so?
Well, imagine someone comes to you with a highly specific intellectual objection. Let's say they've spent months studying ancient Arabic text variations, and they have a legitimate, well-researched academic question.
Okay.
If you try to treat that with emotional psychoanalysis, if you look at them and say, "Brother, who hurt you? You just have a disease in your heart. You're just following your desires."
No, man, that happens all the time. It's so frustrating to watch. It's incredibly dismissive.
It is. It's an intellectual evasion. It's literally just a way of running away from the hard work of actually studying the history.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
The paper insists that the classical Islamic tradition actually has the depth to address both the emotional cry and the rigorous academic challenge. But you have to know what conversation you're in.
Right.
If you give a philosophical answer to an emotional wound, you're arrogant. But if you give an emotional answer to a philosophical question, you're ignorant.
Wow, that's a powerful way to put it. But you know, hearing all this makes me wonder about the posture of doubt today. Is it really about whether God exists at all, or is it something else?
What do you mean?
Well, it seems like a lot of skeptics today aren't actually arguing about the existence of a creator. They look at the state of the world or they look at rules in a scripture and they just say, I don't like this. I don't agree with how this God operates.
Ah, yeah. That is a very sharp observation.
Yeah.
And the paper spends a lot of time on that exact shift, because the posture of the modern skeptic has really changed over time.
How is it viewed classically?
In the classical Islamic paradigm, God is the absolute source of moral value. Whatever God commands, by definition, is what is good and just. Human beings are the ones on trial, trying to align themselves with that divine standard.
Right, like the universe belongs to God, so God sets the rules of the house.
Exactly. But the paper notes that modern psychology often reverses this entirely. A lot of modern objections mirror these early sectarian groups in Islamic history who decided that human moral intuition was the absolute cosmic standard.
So, meaning they elevate their own feelings?
Yes. Today, an individual will elevate their own internal sense of fairness, their own empathy, their own ideas of justice, and make that the ultimate benchmark. And then they put God on trial against that human benchmark.
So they look at a tragedy or they read a harsh ruling from history and they think, well, my internal compass says this is wrong, therefore the religion must be false.
Exactly. If the historical reality of the world violates their personal moral compass, they don't pause and think, hey, maybe my human understanding is limited.
Right. They just assume they're right.
They conclude the divine narrative must be a lie. They're essentially saying, if God doesn't agree with my ethics, God cannot be real.
Okay, so if we accept that this is the posture that people are basically putting God's morality on trial, that leads us straight into the hardest conversation of all.
The problem of evil.
Yes. If God is perfectly merciful and perfectly powerful, why is there so much suffering? Why is the wars, the diseases, innocent people dying? In the video, the objection is framed very specifically.
Right. They ask why God even needs to test humanity if he's all-knowing.
Exactly. If he already knows who will pass and who will fail, what's the point? And how can horrific realities be justified as just a test?
It is arguably the most visceral hurdle for anyone to overcome, and the paper doesn't shy away from it, which I really appreciate. It brings forward classical Sunni responses from major historical thinkers.
Like who?
Scholars like Al-Ghazali, Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, Ibn Taymiyyah. In classical theology, you handle this by looking at three things: divine wisdom, human limitation, and the nature of free will.
Let's break those down.
Well, for these scholars, the fundamental issue is our human epistemic limitation.
Epistemic limitation, so meaning our inability to see the big picture.
Yes. Think about it. We see a localized event, right? A tragedy in our neighborhood, a moment of terrible suffering. Al-Ghazali argues that what appears as purely evil from our tiny localized vantage point is often a relative good when you pull back.
Pull back how far?
When you look at the massive interdependent cosmic order, he talks about the concept of total cosmic good.
Okay, I'm going to push back on that a bit because that sounds really abstract. Let's try to make it concrete. Are you saying the suffering isn't real?
No, no, absolutely not. The pain is intensely real to the human being experiencing it. The classical scholars never, ever denied the pain.
Okay, good. So what do they mean then?
What they mean is that the suffering is not a positive metaphysical entity of pure evil. It's a privation. It's an absence of good in a particular respect, serving a profound wisdom that we just don't have the data to compute.
So it's like a shadow in a painting.
How do you mean?
Well, up close, a shadow just looks like an ugly, dark smear of paint. It ruins the colors. But if you step back 20 feet, you realize that dark smear is exactly what gives the entire painting its depth and its beauty.
That is a really good analogy. Or think of a surgeon. If you walked into a room and saw a man cutting a person's chest open with a knife and you knew nothing about medicine, you'd call that an act of pure evil.
Right, it looks like murder.
But the surgeon is causing localized trauma to save the whole body. The paper actually brings up the story of Moses and Khizr from the Quran as the narrative blueprint for this.
Oh, right, the story where Moses follows this wise figure, Khidr.
Yeah.
And Khidr does things that look completely unjust, like he damages a boat belonging to some poor fisherman.
Yes, and Moses is outraged. Naturally, his moral compass says, this is wrong, you're harming innocent people.
Yeah.
But later, Khidr explains the hidden reality. There was a tyrant king seizing all the intact boats down the river. By damaging the boat slightly, Khidr saved the poor fisherman's livelihood. There was a hidden wisdom.
Okay, I hear that. And I know that story well, but I have to be honest, on behalf of anyone listening who is going through something terrible right now.
Please.
It's one thing to talk about a hidden wisdom behind a damaged wooden boat in an ancient story, but how does an honest, open-minded person apply that logic to something as devastating as systemic warfare or a children's cancer ward?
It's incredibly difficult.
Right. If someone tells a grieving mother, don't worry, there's a hidden wisdom, that sounds incredibly dismissive. It actually sounds cruel.
You're absolutely right. And the paper fully acknowledges this tension. When a philosopher just shrugs and says, well, God has reasons we can't understand, it's called skeptical theism.
Oh,
And it can feel like a cheap way to shut down the conversation.
it really can. It feels like a cop-out.
That's exactly why the paper brings in modern philosophical frameworks alongside the classical theology. It mentions the free will defense. It was famously articulated by the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, but it's heavily utilized by modern Muslim thinkers today.
So how does the free will defense address the cancer ward or the war?
It addresses the logical problem of evil. So the skeptic makes a logical claim. They say, an all-powerful, all-good God and the existence of evil are logically contradictory.
Right, like trying to draw a square circle.
Exactly. They say if he's all-powerful, he can stop the war. If he's all-good, he would want to stop the war. The war exists. Therefore, God either lacks the power or he lacks the goodness.
That is the classic formulation, yeah. It seems pretty airtight on the surface.
But Plantinga, and Islamic theology agrees here, challenges the very premise. They ask a question. Is it logically possible for God to create a world containing genuinely free creatures who always only choose to do what is right?
Well, no. Because if they're forced to do what is right, then they aren't free. They're basically robots.
Exactly. God cannot logically create a world with genuine human free will without allowing the possibility of moral evil.
Okay.
The potential for immense moral goodness. Think about compassion, sacrifice, profound love, courage in the face of danger. All of those virtues require the risk of immense moral failure.
That makes sense. You can't have the virtue of bravery if there is absolutely no danger.
Right. You cannot have true compassion if there is no suffering to alleviate.
So human beings start the wars. Human beings oppress each other. That explains moral evil, the evil caused by our choices.
Yes.
But what about natural evil? Earthquakes, tsunamis,
Yeah.
pandemics, those aren't caused by human free will. You can't blame a tectonic plate shifting on human choices.
This is a crucial distinction. The paper turns to the metaphysical structure of creation itself here. In classical Islamic thought, the world was never designed to be paradise.
Right.
It is structurally designed as a realm of testing, friction, and awe. Natural evil is explained as a necessary feature of a world functioning precisely as a temporary testing ground.
But why? Explain that more. Why is natural evil necessary for a test?
The scholar Ibn Taymiyyah makes a really helpful distinction between God's creative will and God's legislative will. God permits certain structural events to occur in the universe, that is his creative will. The existence of natural laws like gravity, weather patterns, biology, it provides a stable, predictable environment.
Which we need, right?
Exactly. You need a predictable environment for human beings to exercise their free will. If fire burned you today but turned into water tomorrow, you couldn't make any rational choices. Actions wouldn't have predictable consequences.
That makes sense.
But those exact same natural laws mean that tectonic plates will shift and cells will mutate.
So God creates the system, but he doesn't love the suffering it causes. That's the legislative will.
Yes, he does not command or love the pain. But the friction of the world, including illness and natural disasters, provides the environment where humans develop patience, where they search for cures, where they build hospitals,
Wow,
and
okay.
fundamentally where they recognize their own fragility and dependence on the Creator.
That completely reframes the purpose of life. Because if your underlying assumption is that the purpose of life is maximum physical comfort and zero pain, then yeah, this world is a terrible, cruel failure.
Exactly.
But if the purpose of life is moral and spiritual development within a very brief, temporary realm, then the friction, the suffering, is actually the mechanism for that growth. You don't build muscle without tearing the tissue first.
That's spot on. And that brings us back to the first part of the objection you mentioned earlier. If God already knows the outcome, if he knows who will pass and who will fail, why run the test? Why put us through the friction?
Right, why not just put the good people in heaven and the bad people in hell right from the start? Save everyone the trouble.
The classical scholars answer this by pointing out a profound truth about human nature and justice. The paper notes that knowledge of an event does not cause the event.
Say that again?
God's eternal foreknowledge does not coerce your human action. You and I experience our choices as real, unmitigated deliberations. We feel the weight of our decisions, right?
Yeah, of course we do.
The test is not for God to find out what we will do. He already knows. The test is for us to bear witness against ourselves.
To bear witness against ourselves. Oh, I see. So if God just placed a tyrant in hell without letting him actually live his life and commit his crimes.
The tyrant would say, "This is unjust. I never did anything wrong and never had the chance."
Exactly. The friction of this life makes our choices a historical reality. It gives our actions ultimate moral weight. We write our own record.
We do.
Okay, so if life is this severe, meaningful test with real moral weight, then we really have to talk about the ultimate consequence of failing that test, which brings up the debate over hell and divine justice.
Yeah, this is a massive stumbling block for people today.
Because the objection from the secular perspective is all about proportionality. Let's say a person lives an average life. Maybe they're arrogant, they reject God, they commit everyday sins, and they live for, say, 70 years.
Yeah.
How can an eternal, infinite punishment in hell be a just and proportionate response to 70 years of finite human mistakes? It just seems wildly out of balance.
It is a profound question. And the paper maps out how deeply the classical scholars debated this, specifically looking at theological schools like the Ash'ari and Maturidi schools. The core issue really boils down to one thing. How do we actually define justice?
Well, from a modern secular perspective, justice is usually restorative, right? Like rehabilitating a criminal so they can rejoin society. Or it's strictly utilitarian, doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
Yes, and that is a very human-centric view of justice.
Yeah.
But classical Islamic theology operates on the concept of al-hakimiyya.
Al-Hakimiyya.
Right. This means God is the absolute sovereign, the ontological source of moral value. God does not conform to some external standard of justice that sits above him. His actions are what define justice.
I try to think about this in human terms. Let's look at our own legal systems. The duration of a punishment is never strictly tied to the time it took to commit the crime.
What do you mean?
Well, a crime might take literally 1 second to commit. Pulling the trigger of a gun takes 1 second. But that 1 second can result in a lifetime in prison. So time isn't the measure of the crime's weight. The weight is determined by the severity of the violation, the damage done, and the dignity of the authority being defied.
Okay, yes.
Like if you threaten your neighbor over a fence dispute, you might get a fine or a warning. But if you make that exact same threat to a king or a president, you go to federal prison for life. The action was the same, but the authority being defied changes the severity completely.
That is a very solid analogy.
Hold on, I have to push back on my own analogy here.
Go ahead.
Even if a lifetime in prison is a really long time, it is still a finite number of years. A person eventually dies in prison and then it's over. Eternity is infinite. It never, ever ends. Does that analogy really hold up when we bridge the gap between finite time and absolute infinity?
That is the exact philosophical friction point. The paper explains that in Islamic theology, the severity of disbelief of arrogant rebellion against the Creator is measured against the infinite majesty of God. Rejecting an infinite truth carries an infinite weight. The crime is not just a mistake or a slip-up. It's an attempt to subvert reality itself.
Because consciousness itself is a gift from that creator.
Yes. Modern scholars point out that questioning the proportionality of hell usually stems from failing to grasp the gravity of the crime from the divine perspective.
That makes sense.
If you
Yeah.
believe human consciousness is just like a biological accident, a spark in the dark, then yeah, any cosmic punishment seems absurd and cruel.
Just totally disproportionate.
But if human consciousness is a divine trust, and deliberately turning your back on the Creator is the ultimate betrayal of your own existence, then the scales of justice operate on a completely different infinite axis.
Does the classical tradition view hell as strictly infinite for everyone, always? Like, is there any nuance there?
This is where the paper shows the richness of the tradition, which I found fascinating. It notes that there was incredible diversity of thought among classical scholars on this exact issue. Yeah, they had profound historical debates regarding the Arabic word abad, which translates to eternal. Thinkers like Ibn Taymiyyah had very complex, nuanced views on the ultimate duration of hell.
Wait, really? Ibn Taymiyyah questioned the eternity of hell.
It's a deeply nuanced theological debate. Some scholars argue that because the Quran explicitly states that God's mercy encompasses all things, eventually, somewhere in the vast expanse of eternity, that absolute mercy must outpace his wrath.
Wow, I didn't know that was debated.
They debated whether the penal architecture of the afterlife eventually transforms. Now, the point the paper is making isn't to declare one view definitively correct.
Right, it's just reporting the conversation.
Exactly. It's showing that these theological tensions aren't design flaws. They were debated heavily. The severity of the concept is meant to inspire a state of awe and moral seriousness.
So even within the rigid Orthodox tradition, there was space to rigorously debate the mechanics of divine justice, as long as they maintained the absolute authority of God as the ultimate judge.
Exactly. The tradition is much wider and more intellectually accommodating than the brittle, rigid versions of faith that many young people are taught today.
All right, let's shift gears completely, because usually when a skeptical mind is struggling with the abstract theology of the unseen, like the nature of God, free will, eternity, they hit a wall.
Yeah, theology can be exhausting.
So they turn their attention to the tangible evidence we possess right now in the physical world. And that always means examining the scripture itself, the physical book.
Right.
So the next major cluster the paper dissects is the origins of the Quranic narratives.
This is a huge driver of intellectual deconversion today. A young person goes to university, they take a comparative religion class, and they are presented with an objection that feels absolutely devastating.
What's the objection?
The objection states that when you read the Quran, the stories look incredibly familiar if you know the literary environment of the Middle East in the 7th century, what historians call late antiquity.
Familiar how? Give me some examples of what they mean.
Well, for instance, the story of Dhul Qarnayn. He's the great traveler and king in the Quran. The narrative beats of his story strongly resemble older Syriac legends, specifically something called the Alexander Romance.
Okay.
Or take the narrative of Yusuf, the prophet Joseph. If you read the Quranic version, it actually mirrors Jewish midrash, which are rabbinic commentaries and folkloric expansions, more closely than it mirrors the bare, original biblical account in the book of Genesis.
So the skeptical conclusion is pretty straightforward. The Quran is not a divine revelation from the heavens. It's a human document. Muhammad, or whoever authored it, simply borrowed, remixed, and adapted pre-existing legends and folklore from the surrounding Arabian, Jewish, and Christian cultures.
Yeah.
It's essentially an accusation of plagiarism.
That is exactly the modern word they use. Plagiarism. And for a young Muslim who was taught that the Quran was just dropped out of the sky with stories no one had ever heard before, discovering these Syriac and Midrashic parallels can cause a total crisis of faith.
But I look at this and I wonder about the underlying assumption. If the Quran itself repeatedly, openly acknowledges previous revelations, it talks about the Torah, the Gospel, the Psalms constantly, shouldn't similarities be exactly what we expect to find?
You'd think so, yes.
Doesn't the idea of plagiarism assume a very modern Western standard of literary originality? It's like saying, hey, you didn't cite your sources in APA format. That is not how ancient communities understood the transmission of divine truth.
You've hit the nail on the head. That is exactly the counter-framework the paper provides. And it doesn't just use Islamic sources to prove it. It brings in modern Western academic scholarship, too.
Like who?
Historians like Angelica Neuwirth and Nikolai Sinai, who are secular academics, they recognize that the Quran operates within what they call an intertextual horizon.
Intertextual horizon. What does that mean in plain English?
It just means the Quran is in deep, intentional dialogue with the Jewish, Christian, and Arabian traditions of its time.
Yeah.
It is not operating in a vacuum. And classical Islamic scholarship never denied these similarities. No, in fact, the Quran expects its audience to already know these stories. It assumes the listener is intimately familiar with the cultural furniture of the ancient Near East.
But if it's using the same furniture, what makes it a new divine revelation? If the skeptic says, look, I found a 6th century Syriac text with this exact story, what is the classical response to that?
The paper uses a fantastic phrase to describe the Islamic position. They call it surgical correction.
Surgical correction?
Yes, the similarities are not human borrowing. They are divine confirmation and correction. The Quran takes a well-known narrative that has been floating around for centuries, a story that has been distorted by cultural mythology or polytheism, and it strips all that excess away.
It cleans it up.
Exactly. It restores the pure, original theological message of monotheism or tawhid.
Can you give me a specific example of this surgical correction? How does it actually change a story?
The paper highlights the story of the angels prostrating to Adam.
Okay, that's a very famous story. God creates Adam, tells the angels to bow, and Satan refuses.
Right. Now, that narrative frame, angels bowing to the first human, already existed in Jewish and Christian apocryphal literature long before the Quran was revealed.
Okay.
But in those earlier corrupted traditions, the theological focus is often on the exaltation of Adam himself. The angels are bowing because Adam is so glorious, almost divine. It's about how great Adam is.
I see.
The Quran uses that familiar narrative framework because the audience already knows it, but it shifts the entire theological axis.
How so? What changes?
In the Quranic version, the angels are explicitly not glorifying Adam. They are obeying a direct command from God. The prostration is an act of total submission to the divine will. It is a test of obedience for the angels, not a worship of the human being. Do you see the shift?
Wow, yeah. It takes the same characters and the same action, but the meaning is completely different.
Exactly. The story is surgically altered to reinforce absolute uncompromising monotheism. It uses the shared cultural vocabulary of late antiquity to teach a distinctly, fiercely Islamic theology.
So, to the skeptic who triumphantly says, aha, I found a similar story in an older text, the Muslim scholar replies, yes, you did. We knew it was there. But look closely at how the Quran alters that story to correct the theological drift.
Precisely.
It transforms the objection from a proof of clumsy human borrowing into a demonstration of precise divine editorial intent.
Yes, and think about it logically. If God is speaking to a 7th century Arabian audience, he has to use the cultural and narrative language that is legible to them.
Right.
If God revealed a text containing utterly novel alien stories about people and places no one had ever heard of, the text would be incomprehensible to its first audience. They would just dismiss it as madness.
It wouldn't resonate at all.
No. The originality of the Quran, according to the Islamic tradition, lies in its linguistic mastery and its unrelenting theological clarity, not in inventing fictional characters out of whole cloths.
Okay, that makes sense for the narratives. But if the narratives are divine corrections, the next logical target for the skeptical mind is the physical text itself. How did those words, those specific corrections, actually reach us across 1,400 years? The next part of the paper deals with the preservation of the Arabic text and the Uthmanic standardization. And I know this is where the debates get incredibly technical.
It is arguably the most technically intricate objection in the entire paper. The skeptical claim is simple and aggressive, they say. Muslims claim the Quran is perfectly preserved, an immutable text.
Right.
Yet, historical records clearly state that the third caliph of Islam, Uthman, had to standardize the written text. He organized a committee, produced official copies, and then ordered the burning of variant codices.
He burned them?
Yes, he burned the personal copies belonging to prominent, highly respected companions of the Prophet, such as Ibn Masud and Nubay ibn Ka'b. Furthermore, today we know we have multiple variant readings of the Arabic text, known as the Qur'an.
I'm going to stop you right there. Because to a modern ear, the phrase burning variant copies of a religious text sounds like the ultimate undeniable red flag.
It really does sound bad today.
If a government today collected all the variant drafts of a historical document, and just burned them in a massive bonfire, we would immediately, instinctively call it a massive political cover-up.
Without a doubt.
We would assume they were erasing evidence. The atheist or ex-Muslim asks, if the text was perfectly preserved by God, why did it need human editorial control? Why the burning of books? How does the paper navigate that?
The paper unpacks a crucial difference in how ancient societies handled information compared to us. We really have to overcome our modern bias here.
What's our bias?
In the modern world, we are a purely text-based culture. We grant absolute epistemic priority to the written document. If it's not written down and signed in ink, we just don't trust it.
Right, if it's not on paper, it didn't happen.
But in early Islamic society, 7th century Arabia, the primary vehicle of preservation was mass oral transmission. This is known as tuwater.
Oral transmission, so people memorizing it.
Yes, but not just a few isolated people. The Quran was not a physical book first. It was a recitation. It was memorized word for word by thousands of companions and recited aloud in daily prayers 5 times a day in congregation.
So it was a communal activity.
Exactly. It was a living, breathing, auditory reality long before it was a bound book sitting on a shelf.
So the manuscripts, the actual pieces of parchment or animal skin they wrote on, those were secondary.
They were backups. They were personal memory aids. Now, here's where the variations come in. The Quran was originally revealed in a way that accommodated the various Arabian dialects of the time. These are the different aruf.
Okay.
So these personal written notes naturally reflected those dialectical variations. Furthermore, companions like Ibn Masud would write their own personal explanatory notes, exegesis, or tafsir, in the margins of their personal parchment.
Like how I might write notes in the margin of my textbook to help me understand a complex paragraph or define a word I don't know.
Exactly like that. But fast forward a few years. The Islamic Empire expands rapidly. You have soldiers from different tribes mixing and brand new non-Arab converts in places like Syria and Iraq.
Okay, setting the scene.
They are hearing the Quran recited in these different authentic dialects. And because they're new to the faith, and maybe Arabic isn't their first language, they're getting confused. They start arguing over whose recitation is the correct one.
So Uthman's intervention wasn't a tyrannical cover-up to decide what the Quran was. It was a crisis management response to decide how it should be officially written down to prevent a civil war over dialect.
Yes, Uthman did not sit down in a dark room with a secret committee to write a new text. He codified the existing community-wide consensus. He established a single orthographic skeleton, what is called the rasm.
Rasm.
Right. This written consonantal skeleton was brilliantly designed to accommodate all the authentic, prophetically sanctioned oral variations, while simultaneously eliminating all the personal explanatory notes that companions had written in their margins.
So he burned the personal copies to prevent future generations of non-Arabs from looking at an old manuscript and confusing a companion's margin notes with the actual divine text.
Precisely. It wasn't a cover-up. It was a publicly executed standardization. And it was verified by the very people who had memorized the text directly from the prophet's mouth.
Thousands of them.
Right. If Uthman had altered the text, those thousands of people who knew it by heart would have revolted. They wouldn't have just let him change the words of God.
That makes historical sense. But what about modern physical evidence? Because people love to bring up physical manuscripts in these debates.
Yes, they do.
The paper mentions the Sana palimpsest, which is really famous on the internet right now. Skeptics always bring it up as smoking gun proof that the text was unstable and evolving.
The Sana palimpsest is a fascinating piece of history. But first, let's explain what a palimpsest actually is.
Yeah, please do.
In the ancient world, parchment made of animal skin was incredibly expensive. If you had an old text you didn't need anymore, you didn't just throw the parchment away, you washed it, scraped the ink off, and wrote a new text over it.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, but over centuries, the traces of the original lower text can faintly reappear beneath the new text.
So we have a manuscript from Yemen in Sana'a where someone wrote the Quran, but underneath it, faintly visible, is an older version of the Quran.
Yes. Today, paleographers use ultraviolet light and multispectral imaging to read that erased lower text. And the skeptics point to it because the lower text has variations. It doesn't perfectly match the standard Uthmanic text. They say, look, proof the Quran was changed.
And how does the paper respond to that?
The paper cites Dr. Bainam Sadeghi, a leading academic from Stanford who did the most rigorous paleographical study of the Sana manuscript.
And what did he find?
His work demonstrates something remarkable that actually supports the traditional narrative. While the lower text does show some variation, It is organically connected to the known, documented traditions of the companions that we just talked about. It is likely one of those pre-Uthmanic personal codices.
Okay.
But more importantly, the upper text, the one written over it, completely conforms to the Uthmanic standard.
So it physically proves the exact historical event we just talked about. Someone had an older variant personal copy, and when the Uthmanic standard was issued, they washed their old copy and updated it to the new consensus standard.
Exactly. Sadeghi's work shows that the multiple canonical readings we have today are tightly bound by the strict constraints of that Uthmanic skeleton.
It's all consistent.
It is. The variations we see are not the result of messy, erratic copying errors by monks making mistakes in a dark room. They are an intentional, organically preserved aspect of a massive oral tradition mapping onto a written standard.
Okay, I am tracking with you. But I want to ask about a very specific historical objection mentioned in the paper. It's one that causes a lot of anxiety for Muslims reading their own historical sources for the first time.
I think I know which one you mean.
If the text is perfectly preserved, how do traditional Islamic scholars explain the reports in the Hadith literature, the sayings of the Prophet and companions about missing verses? The paper specifically mentions the famous report about the verse of stoning.
Yes, this is a classic example of where a lack of methodological context causes a huge modern crisis.
What's the context?
The paper addresses this head-on through the classical concept of naskh al-tilawa, which translates to the abrogation of recitation.
Abrogation of recitation.
Right. Traditional Islamic methodology establishes that during the Prophet's lifetime, over the 23 years of revelation, there were instances where the recitation of a specific verse was divinely removed from the official corpus of the Quran.
Wait. I'm going to play the skeptic here. Are you telling me the scholars say God revealed a verse, people recited it, and then God explicitly commanded that it no longer be recited as part of the book, even if the legal ruling of the verse remained active?
Yes, that is exactly what the classical tradition states. It was known, categorized, and managed by the companions while the Prophet was still alive. It was not an accidental loss.
But people say it was lost, right?
You will hear popular polemical narratives on the internet about a page being eaten by a goat after the Prophet died.
Mhm.
But academically, this was a recognized theological mechanism of progressive revelation.
I'm going to be honest, that sounds incredibly convenient. Like, oh, we lost the verse, so let's just say God told us to stop reciting it. How does a neutral historian look at that and not immediately assume it's just a cover-up for losing part of the book?
That is a very fair reaction. It really is. And that is exactly where the paper brings in the perspective of modern scholars like Dr. Mustafa Al-Azami. He takes that skeptical argument and completely turns it on its head.
How so?
He argues that the very existence of these reports about missing or abrogated verses in the Hadith literature is the ultimate proof of the rigorous honesty and transparency of early Islamic transmission.
How does admitting you are missing a verse prove honesty?
Think about human nature and political power. If the early Muslim community was a politically motivated cabal trying to engineer a perfectly clean, unassailable, unquestionable text to control the masses, which is what the skeptics claim, what would they have done?
Oh, I see.
They would have completely scrubbed any mention of abrogated verses from their historical records. They had total political control. They would have silenced any companion who talked about it. They would have burned the hadith that mentioned it.
Because leaving those reports in makes the narrative look messy. It invites exactly the kind of skepticism we are talking about right now.
Exactly. The fact that classical scholars openly recorded these discussions, debated them in massive encyclopedias, and preserved the historical memory of these abrogated verses shows that the preservation process was not a hidden, censored political operation.
It was out in the open.
It was a transparent, community-wide effort governed by absolute, terrifying fidelity to what was transmitted. They recorded everything they remembered, exactly as they remembered it.
They were so terrified of hiding the truth that they preserved the messy data, even when it required incredibly complex theological explanations to make sense of it later.
Yes, they preserved the data because they valued historical truth and faithful transmission over a simplistic, easy-to-market narrative.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground. From the emotional landscape of doubt and the psychology of putting God on trial, to the deep philosophy of suffering and evil. We've looked at the mechanics of eternal justice, the historical origins of the ancient narratives, and the rigorous forensic history of the manuscripts.
A lot to process.
It is. And that brings us to the final and perhaps most fundamental section of the paper. It is about epistemology.
Right.
How do we know what we know? How does a person living today in a world of smartphones and scientific materialism navigate certainty?
The paper distills the ultimate epistemological objection down to this core frustration. Why does God demand belief in the unseen, what the Quran calls al-ghaib, while providing historical testimony, Kabar, that modern skeptics view as inherently prone to human error?
It's the ultimate demand for empirical proof.
Yeah.
The modern skeptic looks at the stakes, eternal heaven or eternal hell, and says, if the stakes are that high, why did the public, undeniable cosmic miracles stop? Why did splitting the sea or splitting the moon happen thousands of years ago? Why did miracles stop precisely at the dawn of the modern era, just when we developed mass documentation and video cameras to actually verify them?
Right, they want footage.
They're asking, why can't God just write it in the stars or appear in the sky? Why rely on Urd books and oral chains of transmission?
And the response from modern Muslim scholars, people like Yasir Qadhi and Hamza Tsortsis, who are highlighted in the paper, is that this demand is built on a fundamental category error.
Another category error.
Yes, it is expecting the exact same type of empirical proof for metaphysics that one expects for physics.
What do you mean by that? Break down the difference for me.
Science, the study of physics and the material world, relies on uniformitarian laws, repeatability, and empirical observation. You drop a ball, it falls. You do it 100 times, it falls 100 times. You measure it.
Right.
Religion, which deals with metaphysics, purpose, and the unseen, relies on a different set of tools. It relies on testimony, historical continuity, rational deduction from the order of the universe, and spiritual intuition.
So demanding camera footage of an angel is like using a thermometer to measure the weight of a stone. You are using the wrong instrument for the reality you are trying to measure.
That is a perfect analogy. You will never find the weight of the stone with a thermometer. And if you conclude the stone has no weight because the thermometer didn't register it, you are the one making the error.
Wow, yeah.
The paper points out that the traditional Islamic worldview does not reject reason, not at all, but it balances human reason, historical evidence, and divine revelation in a holistic framework. It requires something very rare today: epistemic humility.
Recognizing that our brains can't comprehend everything in the universe.
Yes. For the believer, this holistic framework is deeply, profoundly coherent. It explains the purpose of life, the nature of human consciousness, the foundation of objective morality, and the drive for meaning in a way that scientific naturalism simply cannot.
But for the skeptic,
For the skeptic who insists on coercive, laboratory-style, empirical proof for the unseen, the evidence will always be deemed insufficient.
I want to go back to a thought I had earlier about the nature of the test. We talked about why God tests us with suffering. Let's think about gravity.
Okay.
If I am holding my tea glass right now and I let go of it, I don't believe it will hit the floor. I know it. I am forced to acknowledge gravity because the physical evidence is coercive. There is no moral virtue in me accepting the law of gravity.
Right. Nobody gets a reward for believing in gravity.
So, if God's existence was as physically obvious as this courtyard we're sitting in, if God wrote his name in the sky in giant letters every morning, or if angels walked down the street where we could film them on our phones, would life still be a test of character, or would it just be a forced acknowledgement of reality?
That's a great point.
The hiddenness of the unseen seems to be the prerequisite for free will.
That is the absolute crux of the Islamic epistemological defense. If the divine presence were overwhelmingly physically obvious, the human ego would be crushed into submission.
There would be no choice.
There would be no room for genuine trust. There would be no room for the human heart to seek out the truth through the noise and distractions of the world. There'd be no room for patience or sincerity or love.
So the ambiguity is intentional.
The ambiguity of the world, the fact that you have to look for the signs, is the very mechanism that allows human beings to exercise moral agency. The evidence is sufficient for those who seek it sincerely, but it is deliberately not coercive for those who wish to turn away.
It requires a pure heart, not just a sharp mind. The paper mentions that modern scholars really emphasize dialogue, compassion, and removing cultural distortions of Islam.
Yes, very much so.
They acknowledge that classical scholarship contains legitimate disagreements. We talked about the debates on the duration of hell or the exact mechanics of how textual variants were handled. And acknowledging that doesn't compromise core orthodoxy, it actually shows the richness and the intellectual confidence of the tradition.
Intellectual confidence is the key phrase there. The classical scholars were not afraid of the missing verses or the variant readings or the massive philosophical paradoxes of free will and predestination.
They didn't bury them.
They didn't hide them at all. They built massive, brilliant intellectual systems to understand them. The modern crisis often happens because people today are taught a very brittle, simplistic, culturally diluted version of the faith.
Right, it's fragile.
So when they go online and encounter the actual complexity of history or philosophy, that brittle version shatters. The paper argues that the solution is not to run from the complexity or to call people heretics for asking questions. The solution is to lean into the robust, sophisticated resources that the Islamic intellectual tradition has possessed for centuries.
We have been talking for a while, and the sun is starting to shift.
Yeah, getting a bit late.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground, from the psychology of doubt to the profound problem of suffering, from the historical reality of how the Quran was assembled to the philosophical limits of human reason. Before we wrap up our time here, what is the final thought, the overarching point we should take away from this entire analysis of Sahil and Dr. Siddiqui's dialogue?
The paper leaves us with a reflection that I think beautifully ties all of this together. The resolution to a crisis of faith almost never comes from a single piece of irrefutable manuscript evidence or a perfectly constructed philosophical syllogism.
Meaning, one argument isn't going to fix everything?
Right. No one reads a dense paleographical analysis of the Sana palimpsest and suddenly falls to their knees in prayer. That isn't how human beings work. The resolution comes from realizing that every single worldview, including secular atheism, has unresolved tensions and profound mysteries.
Every worldview requires a leap.
Yes, atheism has the massive problem of human consciousness. It has the problem of establishing any objective morality without a lawgiver. It is the ultimate problem of explaining how something came from nothing.
Right.
The question isn't whether a worldview has mysteries or friction points. They all do. The real question is whether its foundational framework provides a meaningful, morally coherent, and intellectually sustainable way to navigate the entirety of the human experience, the joy, the suffering, the intellect, and the soul.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.